Okay, so we left off by saying anyone can create money. The trick is to get it accepted, right? So then why do people accept what is otherwise worthless government IOUs, right? I mean, this is just a green piece of paper. So why does everyone accept this? We came to the conclusion that it's because taxes drives money, right? In the MMT, the modern monetary theory chartist approach, the fact that everyone has to pay their taxes using these green pieces of paper leads them to use money. So it's taxes that drives money, okay? Now, we said that this is very different from metalism, okay? In fact, with metalism, we said metalists believe that, metalists who are typically neoclassical Keynesians, believe that money was always a precious metal until the government got involved and started giving us these. Well, in fact, if we look at the history of money, if we look for the last 4,000 years, we actually see that money was typically never precious metals. Okay? There are rare exceptions here and there, but most of the time money was not precious metals. In ancient Egypt, in Babylonia, they were clay pots. Okay? And incidentally, that's where writing originated. Okay? Writing was created to keep track of money, right? It was, okay, 5, that's 5, right? It was a unit of account. Writing was created to keep track of units of account. So in Babylonia, it was clay tablets that were called shubadi. In the southeastern islands, they were always typically something that was very clumsy. So a huge stone. We're talking, the Trobriand Islanders had money that was at least 15 tons, right? Huge stones. In England, we find that money was actually called stocks. Yep, that's where stocks comes from, where equities, like the stock market, comes from. What happened was you had 2 sticks, and you'd break them off. And then the only way to know whether a transaction was good, whole or not, was they had to be replaced. And if it was a perfect match, then the transaction was canceled out. Okay? In each one of the examples I've just given you, and the list goes on and on and on, I'm giving you stones, clay tablets, and wooden sticks. That's very, very far away from precious metals. Okay? So this metalist story, the idea that money was gold until the government got involved, is actually completely fictitious. And I mentioned that everyone except for economists doesn't take it seriously at all. Okay? In fact, what you come to realize, once you recognize taxes is what drives money, is that the government is always involved in monetary creation. Not endogenous money, right? Banks can create money on their own. But at the beginning of any civilization, it's always the government that is what's responsible for creating the money. Let's just think about our country, 1776, right? Technically, we became a country in 1789 with the passing of the Constitution. What money did we have then? We set up the first continental bank, right? We had continentals before dollars, okay? The government created those. When those banks didn't succeed, eventually we have gotten dollars, okay? It's always the government who is intimately linked with the creation or the beginning of monetary relations in any society. Okay? So now we're going to sort of transition from the endogenous money stuff, and we're going to talk strictly about not just U.S. government. We're going to talk about the way governments spend money. Okay? Most of the time you think, well, the government needs to take in taxes and then they spend money. And if they want to spend a little more, they issue bonds, which markets loan them money and then they spend that money, okay? We're going to see that's absolutely incorrect as long as you're dealing with a federal government, okay? As long as you're dealing with the national government, that's completely wrong. Like I said, don't shoot the messenger, okay? Anyone can create money. The trick is to get it accepted. Okay, so far so good. Well, why do we accept these green pieces of paper? Well, it's because we have to pay our taxes in them. Okay, now let's just ask a quick logical question. Who makes these? The government. Okay, well if the government makes these, how do you get your hands on them? Well, the government spends it, right? The government buys something from us, whether it's tanks, healthcare, bridges, whatever. The government buys something, which then gives us, if you could imagine you're the citizens and I'm the government, okay? I would like you to go build a bridge. You go build the bridge. I create these things. There you go, okay? I created this money. Now you have the amount of money necessary to pay the taxes that you owe me, okay? So, there's a lot of different conclusions we can draw from this, but the first one is, why in the world does a government issue green pieces of paper? The reason all governments, except for those in the Eurozone these days, that was an anomaly, okay? But the reason governments make money is because they want to mobilize real resources, okay? They want to mobilize real resources. In other words, let's say we're in Jersey City, let's take the Pulaski Skyway. The Pulaski Skyway, before it even existed, right? It'd be a real pain in the neck to get from northern and western New Jersey into Jersey City, right? You had to take the 1 and 9 truck route, I would assume, okay? Terribly inefficient, lights everywhere. Well, let's say the federal government, the government of the United States, decided, you know what, we want to help out the people of Jersey City. We're going to build a bridge from Newark to Jersey City. Okay, well how do you get people to do that? Well, you start off by saying, the federal government says, look, you are in debt to us $15. Okay? Well, I don't want to be in debt to the government because if I don't pay my taxes, you know, I could go to jail, right? In hundreds of years ago, you might have your head off, okay? So, what'd you end up doing? Well, I don't want to be in debt to the government and go to jail. I better find out what I need to do in order to get out of debt. The government says, hey, if you go and build the Pulaski Skyway, or whatever, you build a tank, or you provide health care, if you do that, if you mobilize your real resources, right? What's a real resource? My labor. That's a real resource. It's a resource we have that can make real things, okay? If you mobilize your real resources and go build the Pulaski Skyway, then we're going to pay you $100, okay? So, you mobilize your real resource, you go build the Pulaski Skyway, and the government gives you 5 of these. Now let's say you were taxed $20. Well, you hand the government this, and you get to keep 4 others, okay? Here is the question I have. The government simply created that money, okay? The government is a currency issuer, right? The federal government in Washington, D.C. is the entity that issued this. They're the ones who created this, okay? Here's the question. I hope it comes through the video sufficiently. Because usually around this time is when people's eyes get really big and things like that, and obviously I can't tell. So, here's the question. Did taxes finance this Pulaski Skyway being built, right? In our fictitious example. Did taxes finance the government? The answer is no, right? The government said, you are in debt, right? I'm the government, you're the workers. I said, you are in debt to me $20, okay? You said, oh no, I don't want to be in debt. How do I get out of it? Go build the Skyway. You built the Skyway, and I simply created these, right? I created these and paid you. You didn't have to give me any of these in advance in order for me to create these, which I would then pay to you, okay? It may sound a little confusing with dollars, so let's make up an easier example. Let's say, or a more extraordinary example to really highlight the logic. Let's say it was the Pulaski Skyway again, but now I tax you not in dollars, but in Rafferties. Okay? I say, you owe me 20 Rafferties, or else all of you are going to get Fs in this class. Well, okay, I don't want to go to jail, I don't want to get an F, right? So, what do I have to do? You need to go build the Pulaski Skyway, and I'll give you 20 Rafferties. Well, okay. So, you go and you build the Skyway, and then I create 20 Rafferties for each of you, and you then have the amount of funds necessary to pay me the tax, right? Which is essentially me saying, I owe you for building the bridge, here, take this, take a Rafferty, and then you end up paying it back to me, okay? So I owe you, I am liable to accept these in tax payments, okay? Let me ask you this then, now that I've changed it from dollars to Rafferties. Did I need to borrow or tax Rafferties before I created them? No, of course not. I'm the currency issuer. I am Rafferty. I can create as many Rafferties as I want, whenever I want. All I gotta do is go to the computer, type in numbers into an account, and I can create Rafferties whenever I see fit. The same thing applies for the United States dollar. The United States government makes the United States dollar. It can create as many of these as it wants to, whenever it wants to. It does not require taxes in order to spend. The state of New Jersey, Chris Christie, as of right now, okay, whoever the next governor is, who knows, but the state of New Jersey does require taxes. The state is not allowed to make these, okay? So the state does need to tax you in order to spend, but the federal government makes these. They don't need to get these from you in order to spend them again. They make them. If I want to spend over there, I can just make these, right? Go to the computer, type in some numbers, voila, money. Okay? Remember, anyone can create money. The trick is to get it accepted. Well, if the government makes this, well then there's no real constraint on the ability to make this, right? You just better hope the electricity doesn't get turned off, like my light. Okay? So, what we end up seeing here is quite an interesting thing. Do taxes finance the United States government? The answer is no. And this is exactly what Alan Greenspan, Ben Bernanke, and Frank Newman have all said. Said, no, the U.S. government makes money as it needs to pay its bills. Therefore, taxes does not finance the United States government. Like I said, I'm just the messenger. Don't shoot him, okay? So in other words, what do taxes do? Okay? In other words, why have taxes if the government doesn't need to generate money from them in order to spend? The answer is it creates a demand for the currency. Okay? It creates a demand for the currency. The same way I needed to tax you in Rafferty's in order to get you to do something for me, build the Pulaski Skyway, right? The federal government needs to tax you in dollars to make sure that you will mobilize your real resources, okay? So the federal government taxes you, says you owe $100 every year, whatever, I'm making it simple, right? Well, you say, oh no, I'm in debt $100, I don't want to go to jail. Good, now mobilize your real resources. Start selling your labor, whether it's to the government or it's to the private sector, where you can get these, which you then will pay back to the government, okay? So logically, government spending precedes taxation. What do taxes do? They make sure that every single United States citizen will always have a demand for these, okay? Which means, as a corollary, that implies the United States dollar will never become worthless. You hear a lot of people running around on the news saying, oh, the US dollar is about to become worthless. The US dollar is about to become worthless. No, it's not. As long as every single citizen must pay their taxes in dollars, there's always going to be a demand for dollars, right? Maybe foreigners, maybe other countries don't want to hold dollars. But that could happen today, tomorrow, that can happen at any time. You can't rely on that. What we do know is that the dollar will not become worthless because every single American always needs to pay their taxes in dollars. Okay? This is and just for the record, right? You might be saying to yourself, taxes don't finance the government? That doesn't make any sense. That's completely contradictory to everything I've ever heard. Right now, you could pause this lecture if you want. Right now, go to YouTube and type in Ben Bernanke, who was the chairman of the Federal Reserve when the economy crashed in 2008. Go to YouTube, type in something along the lines of Ben Bernanke, 60 Minutes, Taxpayer Bailout. And Ben Bernanke is going to be asked a question. So if you guys remember, the bailouts was when the federal government gave a lot of money. In fact, it was about $29 trillion. When the federal government gave $29 trillion to all the banks that caused the crisis in the first place. Okay? Anyway, Ben Bernanke is asked by 60 Minutes, hey, all those bailouts for the banks, was that taxpayer money? And Ben Bernanke says, no, it wasn't taxpayer money. So the host of 60 Minutes says, what do you mean it wasn't taxpayer money? Ben Bernanke says, well, when we need to create money, we simply go to the computer and mark up the accounts. The same way Bank of America marked up my account with endogenous money, right? All you do is you walk over, you go into a spreadsheet, and you say, oh, Bank of America needs $900 million again. Boop, there you go, and it goes off. That's creating money, okay? And I encourage you to look it up right now. Google Ben Bernanke, 60 Minutes, taxpayer-funded bailout, okay? The point is that you don't hear this quite often, except the people who are in charge know this is exactly how it works. Taxes do not finance government spending. Taxes, all they do is they create a demand for the currency, okay? Taxes drives money. That's what the point of taxes are, okay? Next, well, if the government doesn't need taxes, then why do they issue bonds, right? Why does the government issue 30-day, 90-day, 30-day, 90-day, 6-month, 1-year, 2-year, 10-year, 5-year, 15-year, 30-year bonds? Why does the government offer bonds? Why does the government offer bonds? To be sure, some people in the government truly believe that the government needs to borrow money in order to spend. They're out there, okay? But a lot of people on the inside know that the government doesn't need to borrow money in order to spend, okay? In fact, bonds serve another purpose altogether. Bonds are used to set interest rates. Specifically, bonds are used to set the overnight rate, or what is known as the federal funds rate. Okay? In America, it's called the federal funds rate. In other countries, it has different names, but it's the rate at which banks lend money to other banks. Okay? So if you remember back to our endogenous money discussion, in endogenous money, banks make loans, which create deposits, and then they need to go out and get reserves. Okay? Well, the federal funds market is where banks loan reserves to one another. Okay? Let's say I'm Bank of America and you are Chase. Okay? Well, let's say I had a really busy day. Right? A lot of people came to me for loans. Okay? So I actually need quite a lot of reserves, right? I made a lot of loans, and the government says I have to hold some reserves against the loans. Well, okay. If that happens, let's say there was also a pretty slow day over at Chase, right? Nobody really came to Chase for any loans, okay? That means you probably have some extra reserves, and I have a demand for those reserves. Well, if that happens, in the federal funds market, what you do is you will loan your reserves to me at a particular interest rate, okay? And the rate of interest at which you're going to loan them to me is known as the federal funds rate, okay? So you loan them to me at some rate of interest that I have to pay you, okay? That is the interest rate that the government sets. And the U.S. government issues interest rates, the U.S. government issues bonds in order to set interest rates, okay? Let's look at how that works right now. And let's get this string out of the way. Okay. Typically, the Federal Reserve and the government, which one and the same thing, like to keep the interest rate, the overnight rate, the federal funds rate, they like to keep it within a certain range or a band, okay? So let's say they want to keep it between 3 and 4%, okay? It's usually way more precise than that, but we're just going to make an easy example, okay? So they want to keep it between 3 and 4%, okay? So in other words, if you, Chase, was to loan me, Bank of America, $10 worth of reserves, right? You loan me $10 of reserves. Well, if the interest rate was 3%, then eventually I'm going to have to give you the $10 of reserves back along with 30 cents, okay? Which may seem insignificant, but they're not exactly working with $10 loans. These are the biggest banks in the world. They're working with hundreds of millions of dollars of reserves. So it turns into large amounts of money, okay? Anyway, the Federal Reserve always wants to keep the interest rate between 3 and 4% in this example, okay? Well, when the government spends, let's say the government runs a deficit, which means that it spends more than it takes in, okay? A deficit is when the government spends more than it takes in, okay? So a government deficit would be, I tax you, I spend $20 on a tank, but I only take in $10 in taxes, right? That means there's an extra $10 in the economy, okay? If that was to happen, if the government was to run a deficit, what would end up happening is now there's extra money in the economy. Okay? If there's extra money in the economy, that means now the money is relatively abundant, right? There's plenty to go around. So the interest rate, which does bob along like this throughout the day. Let's say here the government ran a deficit. Here the government ran a deficit and they put a lot of money into the economy that wasn't there previously. Well, when that happens, now there's so much money in the economy, it's relatively abundant, which means that it is less valuable, which means the interest rate will go down. Let's say it gets outside of the band, okay? Let's say it goes all the way to 2%. Well, the government doesn't want that. The government wants the interest rate to be at 3 to 4%. I just wrote 2% there. Okay? The government doesn't want it to be at 2%, it wants it to be at 3 to 4%. Okay, well, how do we make sure it gets back up into the band? What happens is the Federal Reserve uses bonds. Specifically, they use U.S. Treasury securities. Okay? The Federal Reserve goes into the market. It's called open market operations. The Federal Reserve goes into the Treasury market and it starts selling treasuries. Okay? The Federal Reserve sells bonds in the overnight market. Okay? Who does it sell it to? It sells treasuries to banks. Okay? So the banks, and why would a bank accept treasuries? Well, here they're only holding reserves. Right? It's just this money I'm holding in an account and that's it. But treasuries pay interest. So basically, would you like to pay interest? Or would you like to receive interest? Or would you like to receive nothing? Well, banks would always love to receive interest. So what you do is, the federal government, the Federal Reserve, when it goes into the overnight market and sells treasuries, what it's doing is it's taking reserves out of the system. Okay? So let's think about this again from the very beginning, because we're talking about what do bonds do? Okay? The interest rate was bobbing along. And then the federal government decided that it was going to buy 100 tanks. So it ran a big deficit. It put more money in the economy than it took out. So there's more money out there. Okay? That made money relatively abundant, which made it less valuable. That pushed the interest rate down to 2%. The alarms go off at the Federal Reserve. Oh no, wait, it can't be 2%. We need it to be between 3 and 4%. Well, okay, now what do we do? Well, the Federal Reserve goes into the overnight market and it sells treasury bonds. Okay? It sells bonds to the banks and takes reserves out of the system, right? It's basically saying to Chase, the bank that you supposedly are, here's a treasury bond, pay me with reserves. Okay? So you do that enough times, you get enough reserves out of the system. If you get the reserves out of the system, then that means reserves are becoming relatively scarce now, which pushes their price back up. Okay? Which means the interest rate goes back in between the targets. Okay? So here's an important lesson. When the government runs a deficit, interest rates actually go down. A lot of the time on the news you hear people saying, the government's running massive deficits, interest rates are about to go through the roof. Well, I don't know where they're getting their information from, because when the government spends more than it takes in, which is a government deficit, that means there is now more money in the economy, which makes it relatively abundant, which pushes its price down. Okay? So government deficits lower interest rates. Also, we were also talking about, what do bonds do? Well, bonds set interest rates. How do they set interest rates? Well, when the government decides to spend and tax and things like that, what the Federal Reserve is doing with bonds, they use them to set the interest rate within a particular band. Okay, so here, bobbing along, U.S. government runs a deficit, which pushed down the interest rate. It made it go below the targeted band. In order to get it back within the targeted band, the government sells treasuries, sells bonds, and takes reserves out of the system. What that does is it pushes interest rates back up. Okay? So when a government runs a deficit, it net increases the quantity of reserves in the overnight market, which pushes down the interest rate. And in order to get those reserves out of the overnight market, the Federal Reserve sells treasuries and buys reserves. Okay? So this is how it actually works. In summary, what do taxes do? Well, they create a demand for the currency. Okay? What do bonds do? They set interest rates. Okay? So, I hope I have convinced you enough by now, or not convinced you, because it is the way it works. I hope I've helped you to understand how government spending works in this country, okay? When the United States government needs to spend, it doesn't need to raise taxes, and it doesn't need to sell bonds. All it needs to do is create the very thing that it is only allowed to do, right? You're not allowed to create these. I'm not allowed to create these. Only the government can create these. It's the same exact thing as Rafferty's, right? If I wanted to spend more Rafferty's, right? If I wanted to buy as many tanks as I could, I wouldn't have to raise taxes on you guys for Rafferty's. I wouldn't have to borrow Rafferty's in some market from China. I wouldn't have to borrow them from China. If I wanted to buy more things using Rafferty's, I would just make more Rafferty's. Okay? The same way the US government can always make more dollars. Okay? So spending is completely unrelated to taxing for the US government. Okay? Now, what that means, and this is where a lot of people sort of get confused, including many professional economists as well, who run into this. That means the idea that the government doesn't require taxes or bonds in order to spend tells us that the government can run deficits from now till the end of time. Okay? The United States government can run a deficit from now until the end of time. How do they do that? They just create more dollars. The same way I could always create more Rafferty's. I can just create them till the end of time. Okay? That does not mean that it should do that. Okay? There's a big difference between being able to do something and should you do something, right? You can drive 135 miles an hour down the turnpike. Should you do it? No. What the government should do, and this is where it's intimately connected with Keynes, right? Keynes said that if effective demand is below full employment, then the government should spend until you get to full employment. Modern monetary theory really supports that, because what modern monetary theory shows is the government can run deficits until you get the economy to full employment. There is absolutely no reason the government or the economy should ever be below full employment. Okay? No reason whatsoever. Okay? The government can always spend until you get to full employment. The government, on the other hand, should never spend more than past full employment. Okay? And we can do this in a diagram right now. I'm simply going to bring back Keynes's supply and demand curves. Okay? Let's say that effective demand in the economy puts us at Y star. Okay? Well, that's not full employment. This is full employment. Okay? We have income, we have prices. Full employment level of output. Currently, spending is too low to get to full employment. Okay? Which it is like it right now, right? It's 2014. Last quarter, the economy just shrunk. If it happens again, we're going to be in a recession. That'll be 6 years after the Great Recession, we go into another recession. Incidentally, not a lot of people are talking about this, but everyone wants to blame the poor economy on the weather. Guess what also happened in the first quarter of 2014? The U.S. government deficit shrunk. The government didn't spend as much as it usually does, and the economy got worse, which supports what I'm saying to you. The government should spend until you get to full employment. Instead, the government stops spending, so it's only natural that employment goes down. It's obvious, had nothing to do with weather. Okay? So, here we are with our D0, with demand 0, right? Which produces an income level, an equilibrium income level, below full employment. Well, if the government can create any amount of money it wants, right? If it can spend until you get to full employment, then what the government should do is shift the demand curve outwards until you get to full employment. Okay? The government shouldn't spend past full employment. That will only create inflation. Okay? If you spend past full employment, there will be inflation. But as long as you have unemployed resources, you should hire them, and that will not create inflation. A lot of people think the government making money, right, will lead to inflation. They think that because of this. Right? It's almost every day, at least on Fox, that you hear, oh, the government making money. Whoops. almost every day on Fox you hear them say, oh, the government's going to print money or the government's creating money, that's going to cause inflation. The reason they think that is because they still believe in mv equals py, right? And we know the assumptions of this are wrong, right? Velocity is not constant, the government doesn't control the money supply, and most importantly, they assume you're at the full employment level of output, right? They assume you are always at full employment. In reality, the economy is almost never at full employment, okay? So the idea that creating money will cause inflation is pretty ridiculous because we're not at full employment. I will not argue that past full employment, it will absolutely cause inflation. It will, okay? Once you have this, your price level is here, right? And if you were to increase demand past full employment, all you would get is an increase of prices. That's inflation. That would make no sense. So just because the government can spend as much money as it wants to doesn't mean it should. What it should do is spend until you get to full employment, okay? It's the same thing as driving a car. Just because you can drive 140 doesn't mean you should. You should operate the car in the proper way, in the most efficient way possible, okay? Which is usually going about 65 miles an hour on a highway, okay? You should operate it the most efficient way possible. The same way, the government should operate the economy the most efficient way possible. And the most efficient way possible means we have full employment. Because if you have full employment, you will not have inflation, and you will be maximizing employment and output, okay? So modern monetary theory and Keynes go hand in hand. You could say that is another synthesis. So you have the neoclassical Keynesian synthesis over here, and then you have modern monetary theory and Keynes over here, okay? Keynes and MMT go well together because it says the government can spend and should spend until you get to full employment, okay? That's exactly what Keynes said. So now, there's three things left for us to do. First, we need to talk about common myths in the United States. We need to talk about myths of government spending, okay? Then we need to talk about the US and China, and we need to talk about the euro. Okay? We're going to cover this one first, then we're going to take a break, and we'll cover the US and China and the euro, okay? So what are some common myths about government spending? What's the common things you hear on the news these days? Well, you hear that we are indebting our grandchildren. We're broke. Right? You hear that the United States is broke, which is a fancy way of saying insolvent. Okay, it means you don't have any money left. China owns us. And finally, you hear that there's going to be inflation or hyperinflation. So we're going to use MMT to evaluate these four commonly heard things about government spending that actually turns out to be nothing but myths. And frankly, it's untrue. Okay? Let's start with the first one, indebting our grandchildren. Basically, the idea is that the US government is spending so much now that our grandchildren and our grandchildren's grandchildren are going to have to pay it all back in the future. Okay? Well, first things first. The United States government ran the largest deficits in the history of the government during World War II. Okay? Largest deficits in history during World War II. Okay? During World War II, the government was about 50% of the economy. It ran massive deficits. Its spending was out of control at the time. Here's the question I ask. How many times have you spoken with your grandparents or an uncle, an aunt, whatever, and said, man, thanks for indebting me so much during World War II? Right? Yeah, never. So our grandchildren are going to say that to us? No, it's ludicrous. The idea that we are indebting our grandchildren is, frankly, a blatant lie. Okay? For those who understand the way the government spends, it's a lie. For those who don't understand how the government spends, it's just a mistaken misinformation. Okay? Are we indebting our grandchildren? Are they going to have to pay back things in the future? Are they going to have to pay higher taxes in the future because we're spending money today? No. United States government can make as many of these as it wants at any time. The same way my grandchild, Devin Rafferty III, the same way Devin Rafferty III will be able to make as many Raffertys as I can right now. Okay? The federal government in 100 years, or 200, or 500, will always be able to make dollars. The same way a Rafferty will always be able to make Raffertys. Okay? So we're not indebting our grandchildren. Which also means, does China own us? No. Right? China does own a lot of treasury bills, but as we'll see, it's for a completely other reason. Okay? China does not own the United States. Frankly, there are two other major players who own more US government bonds than China. Okay? The Federal Reserve owns more government bonds than China, and Japan actually owns more government bonds than China. Okay? Japan, if you believe that China owns the US, well then you better worry more about Japan, because Japan actually owns more government debt than China. Okay? It's, for some reason we're so concerned with China, but we don't really talk about Japan. My suspicion is it's because China used to be a communist nation. They're still communist, but all of their economics is based around markets. I think we just like to use a scare tactic. They're communists and they're coming to get us, okay? Regardless, we are not in debt to them, okay? They own treasury bonds, yes. The same way retirement accounts own treasury bonds. And every time a payment comes due in a treasury bond, we make more of these. And then we give them to China, or to retirement accounts, or to Japan, or to banks. It just so happens China bought a lot of them. And we're going to see why China bought a lot of them. They didn't buy them because they want to own America. They actually buy a lot of treasury bonds because they want to export everything they make to America. Okay? So does China own us? No. Every time China wants to buy a US Treasury bond, that's fine. And then we create dollars to pay them. Okay? So they don't own us. The US is broke. It's insolvent. Is it really broke? Is it insolvent? No. The US government can make dollars at any time. So it's not broke, it's not insolvent, it's not out of money. It can make money whenever it wants. So it's not out of money. The same way I can make Rafferty's whenever I feel like it. So I have never run out of Rafferty's. Okay? So this is wrong as well. Finally, inflation or hyperinflation. You hear this all the time. Inflation, it's coming, it's right around the corner, it's hyperinflation. You heard it in 2008 and 2009 when the banks were bailed out, right? Inflation, it's on its way, watch out, okay? Well, inflation isn't exactly like, a superhero movie star like a Rambo or whatever. It doesn't hide out and wait for the most inopportune time to strike. It happens or it doesn't. And it didn't happen. Okay? As I've said before, there's no connection, major connection, between government spending and inflation before you get to full employment. So, could government spending lead to inflation? Yes, it could. It could lead to it after you get to full employment. But right now, currently in 2014, our economy is so far from full employment that you do not have to worry about inflation at all. In fact, for the last 6 years, prices have been going slightly downwards. Okay? Especially if you take out oil. Oil is the one that keeps prices up. Okay? But if you take out oil, prices have been going down a little bit. Okay? Inflation. Is government spending going to lead to inflation or hyperinflation where prices go up 3, 4, 5,000% every year? No. Okay? It's very simple. If the government spends so much that the economy gets past full employment, then yes, there will be inflation. But until you get to full employment, then no, there won't be inflation. Okay? So, could it lead to it? Yes. Will it? No. You can get to full employment and then just stop there. Once everyone has a job, then that's the amount the government should be spending. Don't spend any more, don't spend any less. The same way, you should drive your car up to 65 miles an hour, right? You shouldn't drive it any faster, you probably shouldn't drive it any slower. Okay? I know you guys will or won't, but I think you get the analogy, right? The most efficient way to drive your car would be 65 miles an hour. The same way, the most efficient way the government could run the economy is if it gets the economy to full employment and then stops there. Once that happens, inflation is not a concern. Okay? So this one, incorrect as well. Like I said, they are all myths. Myths. They're something that aren't true. We keep saying these stories over and over again like they are true, but they're not. Okay? I was going to take a break for US and China and the euro, but I guess we could probably keep on going now. I think I still have about a half hour for this lecture, but it shouldn't take that long. So, why does China, let's talk about the US and China first. Why does China buy up all of these US government bonds all the time? Okay? For those who don't know, China has a fixed exchange rate against the US dollar. Okay? What that means is China tries to keep, I think right now it's 6-1. China tries to make sure that it takes 6 of its currency to purchase $1. Okay? Takes 6 renminbi to purchase $1 US dollar. Why do they do that? I don't want to get into it, but it allows them to export very cheaply. Okay? Which is why probably everything in the room that you are in right now is made in China. In fact, the camera I'm probably talking into right now is made in China. Okay? So they intentionally keep their currency cheap relative to ours because they want to keep exporting to us. Well, okay, that's great, Devin. Where do government bonds fit in? Okay? Well, government bonds fit in very easily. Let's say a US company, Apple, decides to purchase the iPhone from companies in China. Happens all the time. That's actually how Apple operates. Okay? So Apple buys a whole bunch of these things we call iPhones from China. Okay? When it does that, it puts more dollars on the international market. Okay? More US dollars are in the international monetary market. So if you have an exchange rate that's set at 6-1, this is the US dollar and this is the Chinese renminbi, Chinese currency. Okay? If there's more US dollars on the international market, that means they are relatively more abundant, which makes them less valuable. So their price starts going down. Okay? It may go from 6-1 to 6-2, to 6-3, to 6-4, okay? So it starts going down. The Chinese government does not like that, okay? Because it doesn't allow them to export as easily to the United States, okay? They want it to be 6-1, okay? 6-1 allows them to keep sending this video camera, iPhones, these shirts, everything gets sent from China to the US. So, when the United States buys things from China and the exchange rate starts to collapse, okay? And it collapses because, remember, the US is buying stuff from China, puts more dollars on the international market, which means they're relatively more abundant, which makes them less valuable. So the exchange rate starts collapsing. Well, in order to get the dollar back up, the Chinese government creates renminbi, okay? It makes its own currency, goes to the international market, and buys US government bonds, okay? When it buys the US government bonds, there are now less dollars on the international money markets, which means the US dollar is now more scarce, it's relatively more scarce, which makes it more valuable, which pushes it back up, okay? So the relationship between the US and China is that when anyone in the US, when more US dollars go on the international market, they become relatively more abundant, which pushes their price down, making the exchange rate collapse. When that happens, the Chinese government purchases, darn it, start it one more time. Okay? So, the whole mechanism of the US-China relationship is you have a fixed exchange rate because China wants to keep exporting to the US. Whenever anyone in the US, whenever more dollars get onto the international money market, that pushes down, that makes them relatively more abundant and therefore less valuable, which pushes down the exchange rate. The exchange rate starts to collapse, which means China purchases more US bonds, right? China creates its own currency. It uses renminbis, right? Uses renminbis to buy treasury bonds, okay? It makes renminbis to buy bonds, which means this exchange rate that was collapsing, now there's less US dollars on the international market, which makes them relatively scarce, which pushes up their value. And therefore the exchange rate goes back to where China wants it to be, which is at 6-to-1. So the reason China buys up so many US government bonds is not because they want to own America, okay, or because they're interested in taking over this country. In fact, as it turns out, China buys up so many US government bonds because they want to keep exporting all their stuff to us. Okay? They buy up US government bonds because they want to manage the exchange rate between the US and China. Okay? So if you think about it through that lens, a lot of what you hear on the news is quite silly, right? China wants to own the US, China wants to buy the United States. No. What China wants to do, think about what they're really doing now. They are putting in all the work, right? They're making the products, they're making these shirts, the video cameras, the iPhones. They're putting in the work and they want to send it to us, okay? In exchange for something that we can make as much of as we want. There's no limit to our ability to make this. And China is working really hard to make these, or to get their hands on these. And we think this is a problem. They're they're making iPhones, tablets, all the cool things, all the gizmos we have in our houses. Okay? They're making all of it so they can get their hands on this, something that our country makes whenever we feel like it. And this is a problem? China is not buying US Treasury bonds so they can own our country. They are buying US Treasury bonds so they can manage the exchange rate between the US and China so they can continue to export to this country. Finally, there's the euro. Okay? What's going on with the euro? And I hope you have read Professor Bell, right? She wrote a book called The State, the Market, and the Euro, or edited it, I believe. She might have written it. Now her name is Kelton, K-E-L-T-O-N. She got married, changed her last name. And the problem with the euro, and she has been saying this since the mid-90s at least. The problem with the euro is that every country in the euro went from being a currency issuer to a currency user. Okay? It's as if the United States, let's take Italy for example. Okay? When Italy adopted the euro, they are no longer allowed to create their currency. Okay? Italy used to have the lira. That was the Italian currency. Okay? Italy no longer creates the lira. The only thing that creates the euro is the European Central Bank. Okay? And they don't like creating euros. They really don't like government spending. Okay? So, what happened was the Italian government effectively went from being able to create lira whenever they wanted. Okay? Same way the US government can make this whenever it feels like it. The Italian government went from being able to make lira whenever they wanted to now they have to tax and borrow lira in order to spend. Okay? It's as if Italy went from being equivalent to the United States government, right? The US government can make dollars, the Italian government could make lira, and instead Italy became Vermont or New Jersey, right? New Jersey cannot make the dollar. It's not allowed to. Only the federal government can. New Jersey needs to borrow and tax in order to get money that it can spend. Okay? Well, as it turns out, that's exactly what Italy has to do now as well, because they joined the euro. So the problem with the euro is that every single country who belongs to the euro is now a currency user instead of a currency issuer. Okay? That's a major problem, because now, when all the big European banks crashed, okay? When all the European banks crashed, they no longer have the ability, that is, the European countries, no longer have the ability to deficit spend in order to get themselves out of the crisis. Okay? They can't spend their way out of the crisis because they have to borrow money from markets in order to spend. So if financial markets think you are not creditworthy, such as Italy or Greece, right? If they think you're not creditworthy, like Italy or Greece, they're not going to loan you money, which means you can't spend your way out of the crisis, right? You can't raise effective demand, which means you are stuck in a crisis. Okay? So let's just talk about that one more time. Let's say the economy crashes, as it did in Greece. Okay? So the Greek economy tanks. Well, how do you get out of it? Keynes would say that you have to spend, right? The more you spend, the more cash registers go off. The more cash registers go off, the more businesses boom, and the more businesses will hire people. Okay? So you need to spend in order to get yourself out of the crisis. In America, we did spend. It was called the Obama stimulus. We spent $787 billion to get out of the crisis. Some would say it didn't work. I would say it didn't work. It needed to be bigger. Okay? Because, why would I say that? Well, because we're not at full employment currently. So it wasn't big enough. Okay? But in Greece, so that's what America did. We spent our way out of the crisis immediately. Right? We were losing 800,000 jobs. Now we were only losing 300,000. In Greece, the economy tanked. They would like to spend their way out of the crisis, but they can't, because private financial markets think they have way too much debt on their hands. Okay? Private financial markets say, whoa, we're not going to loan to Greece, that's too much. So nobody will buy up Greek bonds. Nobody will loan Greece money, which means Greece can't spend its way out of the crisis, right? Greece is having a really hard time getting money that it can then spend, which will make cash registers go off, businesses boom, and then employment will go up, okay? Greece is having a really hard time doing that. And the result is they're firing policemen, teachers, firefighters, all the public employees many of us take for granted. Greece has to fire them. The same thing in Italy, Spain, Portugal, Ireland. Did I hit them all? Yeah. Okay? Those problems are going on in all of those countries. Okay? And if you look at the structure of each of those economies, they're all actually very different from one another. Okay? Each of those economies doesn't really have all that much in common. Okay? Unless you think of Portugal and Ireland, Italy and Portugal, Spain and Ireland. Those two are somewhat close, okay? Those two groupings, you could group them like that. But they are vastly different, right? Spain and Ireland and Portugal and Italy are very different structurally, but they're all having major economic problems. Why is that? The answer is because none of them can create the euro. So none of them are allowed out, none of them can create money to get out of the recessions they're in, which at this point they're in depressions, okay? In all those countries you have 30% unemployment, youth unemployment is around 40 to 50%. It's not going to end well, put it that way. The one country that has managed to come out of this okay is Germany. And a lot of people point to Germany and say, hey, look, they're balancing their budgets, they're doing just fine. This is true. You know how Germany is doing just fine? They run an export surplus with the rest of Europe. Okay? Germany has artificially low wages. Okay? Which means they can export quite cheaply. Okay? They export cheaply the same way China exports quite cheaply to the United States. So yes, their government has balanced the budget, but they're actually exporting to the rest of Europe. Okay? And that's why they are doing just fine. If you'd like to look a little more into that, right, we're going to run out of time with this lecture, but if you want to look into that a little more, it's called the three-sector balance. Okay? If you were to Google modern monetary theory, three-sector balance, that would come up and you could read more about it. In fact, I'm sure it's probably on Wikipedia. Okay? But the fundamental problem with the euro, okay, fundamental problem with the euro is not that the Greeks had too much debt, or that Italians were getting old, or that Spanish people took siestas, or that wages were too high in Portugal. Maybe that contributed to some of the problems, but it's not the problem. The problem is that all of these countries went from being currency issuers and turned themselves into currency users. Okay? They used to be able to create the lira, the peso, the drachma, all the other currencies, right? And instead, now they have to borrow and tax euros. So if people don't like your economy, they can effectively shut it down. Just to close up on the euro, let's think about this in terms of the bridge and creating Rafferty's. Okay? Well, if I issue Rafferty's, right, and I want you guys to go build a bridge, it doesn't matter if Wall Street thinks I have too much debt or not. I tax you in Rafferty's, and you say, okay, I better go build a bridge and get Rafferty's. So even if Wall Street thinks that I am so, way in debt up to my ears, this is no good, that doesn't matter, because I still have the ability to tax and spend, right? I taxed you 10 Rafferty's. The only way you're going to get your hands on them is by going and building a bridge, and then I'll pay you for building the bridge, okay? That is what a currency issuer does. A currency user, on the other hand, if I wanted to have you guys build a bridge, I would need to take out a loan from Wall Street. Well, if Wall Street thinks that I'm not worth giving money to, right? If they think I'm not a good borrower, they're never going to give me money, which means I can't build that bridge, or keep that school open, or keep all the policemen that we need on duty. Okay? So what you end up seeing is the entire society will collapse because the government went from being, in the first example, I was a currency issuer. Now, I'm a currency user. It's completely different. Okay? So, that wraps up week 6. I hope you enjoyed this class. I always like teaching it. Just on today's lecture topics, like I said, I know they can seem really odd. It's the first time you've ever heard something like this, most likely, and you could be very confused because it's the first time you've ever heard something like this. However, like I said, don't shoot the messenger. It is the way it works. As you go forward in life, for the next 6 months, year, 2 years, just start thinking about headlines you read through this prism. And I bet you'll start to make a lot of connections you weren't making previously. Where you say, oh, you know what? That is right. Okay. Well, if Greece doesn't spend, the economy is going to keep going down. And what do you know? The economy continues to get worse in Greece or Spain. Okay? Other than that, I hope you enjoyed the course. Right? We started with the history of economic thought tree, taught you the basic macroeconomic concepts, and then I took you from the neoclassicals to Keynes, to the textbook Keynesians, making a synthesis with the neoclassicals, and then finally we talked about modern monetary theory and Keynes's followers. Okay? Once again, I hope you enjoyed it, and look forward to maybe meeting you around campus sometime in the future. Don't hesitate to say hi if you see me. Okay? Bye-bye.